Hello, Red Cedar. How are all of you doing? How are you managing this strange and very unique moment in our lifetime? I'm wondering, are you able every so often to look beyond the day-to-day reality of this strange time and ask the question, I wonder what God is doing? How is this worldwide shakeup advancing his kingdom? Well, I came across a couple observations in the Word recently that have been helping me convert my impatience and uncertainty into a kind of prayer energizing expectancy. And so I wanted to pass along those observations to all of you in hopes that maybe they might help as well. The first one comes from Genesis chapter 15, and here God is telling Abraham, he's reminding him, restating the promise to him that he's going to make of him a great nation and he's going to give him a great land. But right in the middle of it, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, he says something completely unexpected. He says, Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be strangers in a foreign land and servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And this leads me to the first observation that the promise of glory, the promise of home, always involves an unexpectedly long wilderness. We saw in the message on Easter Sunday, Jesus said, the seed has to be buried before it blossoms. He says, and then he applies it to us, just as I took up the cross, so you must take up the cross. And so this is how I apply that to our current situation. We're being told that the curve is flattening, and that's good news. But I actually think the real test of this whole experience is yet to come. It's the question of when and the question of what. When will life go back to normal, and what will be the new normal? And for many of us right now in Red Cedar, I suspect life is just simply we're just experiencing this whole thing as a frustrating inconvenience. We're not really in intense suffering necessarily, but something of this magnitude that's affecting the entire world could very well permanently reshape our culture. And when it does, it will ripple out and affect all of us. And that's why I say the real test of this is yet to come. It could be weeks, it could be months, if not years away. That's the hard news. But that's not all the news. In that same passage in Genesis chapter 15, God goes on to tell Abraham, but I will bring judgment on your oppressor. And when you come out of those 400 years, you will come out with great possessions, and I will bring you back to your home. And then several years later, God would tell Abraham's grandson, Jacob, in Genesis chapter 46, he would say, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. I will make you a great nation there. And then he says this really caught my attention. I myself will go down with you, and I myself will bring you up again. And so it's no surprise when we get to Exodus chapter 1 that we read this, that after 400 years, the people of Israel had been fruitful, they had multiplied greatly, and it says the land was filled with them. And then it goes on to even say this in Exodus chapter 1, verse 12, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, which leads to my second observation, that God is not in a hurry to fulfill his promise. That's sort of a repeat of the first observation. But then I go on to say this, but he's never not fulfilling his promise. He's always unfolding his promise in all situations. There's always movement forward with his kingdom purposes. So during those 400 years when I'm sure God's people must have wondered, is there even a God anymore? And is he even keeping his promises? Lo and behold, when the dust settles, yes, he was, and yes, he is. Which leads to the last passage that's been on my mind a lot lately. It's Psalm 130. And I've just been quoting this to myself over and over just because I've been dealing with some of my own personal struggles. But Psalm 130 says, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, have mercy. It goes on to say, if you, Lord, should count our sins, who could survive? But there's forgiveness with you, and you have promised us abundant deliverance. So here's this person, whoever wrote Psalm 130. They're in a hard situation. All they have is the promise of God, and in a sense, the silence of God. They're waiting on Him. But what really caught my attention, and what has helped me tremendously, is verse 6. Verse 6 of Psalm 130 says this: my soul waits for the Lord. Okay, but it's this next phrase: more than the watchman waits for the morning. Now, if you know anything about a watchman, they're like a guard who patrols a city wall. And the watchman doesn't like the night. The night is when they could get attacked. And so they're waiting for morning when they can see well. And so believe me, the kind of waiting the watchman is doing is not sleeping on the job waiting. It's not just, great, I have to wait on God. It's this active anticipation that somehow, some way, morning is going to come through, God is going to come through. And I think this is what would lead to the application of all of this. We've been studying Romans a lot, and we've learned that grace should be spelled with an extra R, that it's about God's reigning righteousness. So that grace is not just a status that God transfers to us, but it's a promise that He's always working in us and in our world. Grace is always reigning over sin. And he's working in us and in our world to shape His church into someone stunningly beautiful. In other words, He's going to make us like Jesus. He's going to make the resurrection something we experience, not just something we believe. So the application is this: since this is true, we should be looking for evidences of that promise in our midst right now of this hard situation. We should be sharing stories about how God's grace is reigning in our situation. And in fact, I'm going to invite you to begin thinking about that. Wouldn't it be great if a bunch of us sent in a 1-minute video or a 2-minute video, whatever, of a story of how you have seen God at work in the midst of this hard situation, how you're seeing grace reigning over sin. So may our Father bless us with eager watching for a more glorifying new normal.